Colonial Brazil functions a little bit differently than the Spanish colonial world that we've been looking at. Here's a map, a Portuguese map of Brazil in the early 16th century. You'll see the Portuguese ships headed in that direction. These were ships that were both coming from Europe and from Africa and Asia, where the Portuguese had trading ports. But the most interesting part is the drawings on what the Portuguese territories are. And you'll see a few Portuguese on that territory, very few. But what you mostly see are indigenous people cutting what is Brazil wood, and the animals that a few of the Portuguese explorers had been making records of. This is not the Brazil that will be the engine of Portuguese colonial growth. This is not the Brazil that has anything in common with the Brazil we know, known for sugar and coffee, cassava, and most of all, slavery. There's no indication of that on this drawing. A really important aspect of the development of Brazil in this colonial world is that Brazil, compared to Mexico and Peru, compared to many other parts of the Spanish Americas, has a really small native population. And so, unlike the Spaniards who relied on indigenous tribute systems and labor systems, who relied on indigenous labor, whom they were not allowed to enslave anyway, but who relied on this very large and dense population for their exploitive needs, the Portuguese did not have that option. And by 1600, most of the labor force in this territory that you saw in the previous slide is provided by Africans who have been enslaved and brought over from Portuguese trading ports in Africa. This is going to develop into a very, very different society. Spanish obviously is not the only language spoken in Latin America, but it is spoken in most countries in Latin America, except for the largest country in Latin America, Brazil, where they speak Portuguese. And this is not the only effect of Portuguese colonization. Slavery is really a defining difference between the Portuguese colonial world and the Spanish colonial world. And it is both at origin different. The Spaniards were not particularly familiar with slavery as an institution. And it also leads to very different outcomes in terms of societies. The world that we're looking at, this colonial world that starts in the 16th century and progresses through 200 years, is a world that was already dominated by trade by the middle of the 16th century. And if you look at the top map, you'll see the red areas are areas that were Portuguese. There were Portuguese claims, and all these Portuguese claims are mostly settled on coastal areas. You'll see that the Portuguese did not settle inland. Theirs was not a settling colonial experience. Theirs was a trading colonial experience, whereas the Spaniards would settle much further inland, and theirs was both trading but also settling. Remember, the Spaniards had both a conquering intent and a conversion intent. The Portuguese were not as concerned with making sure that the people that they colonized were also Christian. The map below is a little geopolitical lesson. The first line, the Treaty of Tordesillas line, is the line that very early in the colonial period identified the part of the Americas that would be Spanish and the part that would be Portuguese. And if you can see through the red circle, that part is not very large. In fact, it corresponds to the part of the circle in the top area, on the top map, where you see the red Portuguese settlements. But if you look at the top map, there's a very large part of South America that remains yellow and remains fairly unsettled for a large part of the colonial period. It was settled mostly by missionaries and other people who did not have access or were not granted access to more densely populated areas and urban areas. The Portuguese, however, did spread inland ultimately, both in search of indigenous labor, which under Portuguese law they were allowed to enslave, but also in search of gold, mineral ore, other potential trading goods. And in 1750, the line of demarcation between what parts of South America belonged to Spain and which ones belonged to Portugal were redrawn based on this notion that who owns by fact owns by law, or in a sense occupies by fact owns by law. And the Portuguese argued that they had settled further inland than this Treaty of Tordesillas line, and since they were the majority in that part of the territory, they should also become their owners. This is going to become a problem for these missionaries that I'd mentioned who set up in these areas, remote areas of the Spanish Americas, and that is part of an assignment that you'll need to do. So I will leave it at that for now.